The sky didn't just turn gray, it turned alive. A billion wings beat against the dry air, creating a sound like a distant freight train that never arrives. It's a low, vibrating hum that gets inside your teeth and stays there. The sun is a pale, sickly ghost behind a curtain of chitin and greed. Down in the valley, the younger men are screaming, throwing fuel on fires that the wind just laughs at. They see the end of their livelihoods in every falling shadow. But Silas remains on his porch, his boots coated in the dust of 5 generations. He isn't reaching for a torch or a chemical sprayer. He's watching the horizon with a look that says he knows something the clouds have forgotten. If you want to see how a man stands when the world crumbles, subscribe to Beyond the Fields. Silas knows that nature doesn't bargain, but it does remember. Silas took a slow pull from a tin cup of water, the liquid tasting of iron and deep earth. Around him, the homestead felt like a fortress under siege. This land wasn't just dirt and rock. It was a diary written in sweat. His great-grandfather had cleared the first acre, with nothing but a mule and a stubborn streak that bordered on madness. They had survived the Great Depression, the searing droughts of the 50s, and the floods that tried to turn the valley into a lake. But this swarm was different. It felt biblical. It felt like the land itself was trying to shake off the people who lived on it. As the sky grew darker, the chickens stopped their scratching and huddled in the coop, sensing the unnatural eclipse. The cows were lowing in the lower pasture, a mournful sound that echoed off the hills. Silas looked at his hands, calloused and mapped with scars from a lifetime of labor. He thought of his wife, buried on the rise under the oak tree, and the way she used to say that the land provides for those who listen to it. The community was unraveling. He could hear the shouting from the neighboring farm, where the Miller boys were trying to beat the insects away with wet burlap sacks. It was a futile dance. Desperation has a specific smell. It's like ozone and sour milk. People were packing their trucks, throwing heirlooms and suitcases into the beds, ready to flee a plague they couldn't fight. They saw a catastrophe. Silas saw a debt coming due. He walked to the edge of his porch and touched the wood of the railing, feeling the vibration of the swarm. It was closer now. The first few scouts landed on the railing, their mechanical legs twitching, their eyes like multifaceted jewels of ruin. He didn't brush them off. He just watched them. He knew the history of the creek that ran through the back of the property, a creek that had been dry for 3 seasons. He knew about the old drainage systems the county had forgotten 50 years ago when they built the new highway. He knew that beneath the parched red clay, there was a memory of water and a rhythm that the modern world had traded for convenience. The darkness wasn't just overhead. It was moving into the hearts of his neighbors. They were looking for someone to blame, looking for a miracle, but they were looking in the wrong places. They looked at the sky with hatred, while Silas looked at the ground with a quiet, terrifying respect. He remembered his father telling him that the earth has a long memory and a short temper. "You don't own the land," his father would say. "You just mind it for a while until it decides it's done with you." Silas stood there as the light failed completely, the midday turning into a bruised purple twilight. The weight of the air felt heavy, pressed down by the sheer mass of the insects. Every leaf in the valley was a target. Every green blade of grass was a casualty waiting to happen. He could hear the crunching now, a sound like a million tiny scissors cutting through silk. It was the sound of a harvest being stolen before it could even be gathered. But Silas didn't move. He waited for the wind to shift, waited for the specific chill that comes right before the dew settles, even in the middle of a plague. He was a man who had outlived his peers and outlasted the trends of modern agriculture. He didn't use the satellite-guided tractors or the genetically modified seeds that promised immunity from the world's ills. He used what was left behind. He used the secrets buried under the silt. As the first wave of the swarm hit his corn on the north fence, he turned and went inside to find his lantern. He wasn't hiding. He was preparing. He knew that the deeper the roots go, the harder they are to pull out, and his roots were wrapped around the very bones of the valley. The desperation outside was a storm, but inside, Silas was a calm center. He checked the mantle, his fingers finding an old rusted iron key that hadn't been turned in half a century. It was cold and heavy, a piece of the past that still had a job to do. The next morning, the dust hadn't settled, but the locusts had. They covered everything like a living, breathing carpet of bronze. And that's when the black SUVs arrived. They looked like shiny beetles themselves, rolling over the gravel with an arrogance that only money can buy. Out stepped the men in silk suits, their polished shoes stepping gingerly onto the ruined earth, as if they were afraid the bankruptcy of the soil might be contagious. These were the representatives from AgriCorp, the conglomerate that had been circling the valley for years like vultures waiting for a heartbeat to stop. They didn't see a disaster, they saw an opportunity. They walked up to Silas's porch, led by a man named Sterling who had a smile that didn't reach his eyes. A smile that looked like it had been practiced in a mirror. Sterling held a clipboard and a fountain pen that probably cost more than Silas's tractor. He started talking about loss mitigation and the inevitable collapse of the local economy. He offered pennies on the dollar, presenting it as an act of charity, a way for the old man to retire with some dignity before the bank took the rest. Silas just leaned against the doorframe, chewing on a piece of dry straw, letting the man talk. Sterling mocked the state of the barn, pointed at the locusts eating the very paint off the walls, and laughed at the idea of staying. "Why die with the dirt?" Sterling asked. "When you can walk away with a check." He talked about the land as if it were nothing but square footage, a line on a balance sheet. He didn't understand the way the sunlight hit the creek at 6 in the morning, or the way the soil felt between your fingers after a spring rain. To him, the locusts were a cleaning crew, clearing out the stubborn old holdouts so the corporation could turn the valley into a sterile, industrial monoculture. The other farmers were already folding. Silas could see them across the road, heads hanging low as they signed the papers, taking the quick exit out of their misery. They were tired of fighting the weather, tired of fighting the debt, and now they were tired of fighting the bugs. But Silas didn't blink. He let Sterling talk until the man's throat was dry. He let him describe the wonderful shopping centers and the high-yield, chemically dependent fields they planned to install. When Sterling finally stopped to breathe, Silas spoke for the first time. He told them the land wasn't for sale, not today and not when the last locust died of hunger. The suits laughed. They called him a relic. They told him he was standing in the way of progress, and that by the end of the week, he wouldn't have enough topsoil left to fill a flower pot. They mocked his stubbornness, calling it senility. They stood there in the heat, smelling of expensive cologne and smugness, while the world around them was being devoured. Silas didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. He just looked past them, toward the old red clay hills where the hidden things lay. He saw the way the insects were moving, following the heat, following the scent of the remaining green. The corporate men thought they were the masters of the situation because they had lawyers and capital. They thought nature was something you could litigate or buy out. They didn't realize that the dirt doesn't care about a contract. Silas watched a locust land on Sterling's expensive sleeve, and the man shrieked, batting it away with a look of pure disgust. It was a small moment, but it told Silas everything he needed to know. These men were tourists in a world of consequences. They didn't belong to the land. They just wanted to harvest its ghost. Silas told them to get off his porch before the sun got too high, because the heat makes people do foolish things. As the SUVs backed out, kicking up a cloud of dust and dead insects, Silas felt a strange sense of peace. The humiliation didn't sting because he didn't respect the people trying to inflict it. He knew the difference between a man who owns land and a man who belongs to it. He watched them drive toward the next farm, ready to strip the hope away from another family, and he gripped the iron key in his pocket. The suits thought they were the winners because they had the money, but Silas had the history. He knew where the old gates were, and he knew that sometimes to save the heart of the farm, you have to let the skin get burned. By Tuesday, the humiliation turned public. The local coffee shop, usually a place of quiet murmurs and weather talk, had become a theater of the desperate. Silas walked in to get a bag of flour, and the silence that met him was heavy enough to choke on. People turned their heads away. They were angry, not at the Locusts but at Silas. They had all sold out, signed the corporate papers, and now Silas's refusal made their surrender look like cowardice. The Miller boys, who had always been a bit hot-headed, started in on him. They called him an old fool. They said his pride was going to get the whole valley leveled because the corporation wouldn't build their infrastructure around one stubborn acre. They laughed at his peripheral crops, which were now nothing but skeletal stalks rattling in the wind. His outer fields of corn and soy were gone, stripped to the ground in a matter of hours. The corporate giants, who had set up a temporary office in a luxury trailer at the edge of town, made sure to broadcast the destruction. They had drones flying over Sis's property, streaming footage of the devastation to prove how helpless he was. They wanted the world to see the old man of the valley, losing everything. Silas stood at the counter, ignored by the clerk who used to call him Uncle, and felt the weight of the town's collective resentment. It's a hard thing to be the last man standing when everyone else has found a reason to sit down. He walked back to his truck, and someone had keyed the word greed into the rusted door. The irony wasn't lost on him. He was the one trying to keep the land as it was, yet he was the villain because he wouldn't let the corporate machine turn the valley into a profit margin. On the drive back, he saw the extent of the loss. The vibrant green valley he had known his entire life was now a dull moving brown. The locusts were everywhere, a carpet of hunger. He saw the corporate teams in their white hazmat suits, spraying experimental chemicals that did nothing but turn the dead insects into a toxic sludge. They were trying to fight biology with chemistry, and they were losing. They gloated as they passed Silas, pointing at his ruined fences and his empty barns. They thought they were watching a man break. They didn't see that he was shedding his skin. He spent the afternoon in the barn, working in the shadows. He didn't look at the fields. He didn't look at the drones buzzing overhead like metallic gnats. He sharpened his old spade. He oiled the hinges of a gate that led nowhere, or so it seemed. Every time a drone hovered near his window, he simply closed the shutters. The humiliation was a shield. It kept them from looking too closely at what he was actually doing. They were so focused on his failure that they stopped anticipating his moves. They thought the story was over, that the climax had already happened when the swarm arrived. But Silas knew that a swarm is just energy looking for a path. If you try to block it, it breaks you. If you give it a direction, it becomes a tool. He felt the ache in his back, a reminder of 70 years of gravity, but he didn't bow. He stood straighter than the men in the suits ever could. He went out to his garden, the small patch of herbs and vegetables near the house that he had kept covered with heavy canvas and old tarps. He pulled back a corner and saw that the soil was still moist, still holding the secret of the spring. He whispered a promise to the dirt. He told the land that he was still here, and that the ones who mocked it would soon find out that the earth doesn't like being laughed at. The corporate giants were busy celebrating their upcoming acquisitions, drinking expensive scotch in their air-conditioned trailers, while the insects chewed through the very foundations of the old world. Silas watched the sun set, a red ball of fire behind the haze of wings, and he knew it was time. The back may be broken, but the spirit was forged in a hotter fire than these men could ever imagine. Midnight in the valley usually sounds like crickets and the rustle of leaves, but tonight it sounded like a factory that never shuts down. Silas walked out into the darkness, carrying nothing but a lantern and that heavy iron key. He didn't head toward the fields. He headed toward the red clay ridge, the place where the limestone was oldest and the ground was scarred by ancient floods. This was the dead man's corner, a patch of land no one wanted because the soil was too hard and the drainage was poor, or so the surveys said. Silas knew better. He reached an old, vine-choked stone structure buried in the side of the hill. It looked like a tomb, but it was an ancient irrigation weir, built by the hands of men who knew how to trap the mountain's runoff before the modern dams diverted everything. He cleared away the briars, his hands bleeding from the thorns, and found the keyhole. It was filled with dirt and the nests of spiders, But the iron was solid. He inserted the key. It didn't turn at first. He leaned into it, his shoulder groaning with the effort, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The corporate suits were asleep in their trailers, dreaming of developments, while an old man in the mud was about to wake up a ghost. With a scream of rusting metal, the key turned, deep underground. There was a sound like a giant waking up. A low subterranean thud vibrated through the soles of his boots. This was the secret, a dormant underground aquifer connected to a series of hidden channels that predated the county maps. By turning that key, Silas wasn't just opening a gate, he was changing the pressure of the valley's water table. He moved down to the second gate, a wooden sluice reinforced with iron that sat at the mouth of a dry ravine. He hammered out the locking pin with a rock. Suddenly, the earth began to weep. Water, cold and dark, began to bubble up from the red clay. It wasn't a flood, it was a deliberate, controlled seepage. He had spent years studying the way the water moved through the limestone layers. He knew that if he saturated the low-lying basin, the very land the corporation had just bought, it would create a localized mist, a microclimate of humidity and cool air that the locusts, being creatures of dry heat, couldn't tolerate. But there was more. He opened the third gate, the one that led into the old saltgrass flats. This water wasn't fresh, it was brackish, drawn from a deep mineral pocket. As the water hit the dry air, the scent changed. It was a sharp, pungent aroma of sulfur and ancient minerals. To a human, it was just a strange smell. To a locust, it was a biological wall. He watched as the water began to carve new paths through the dust, silver ribbons under the moonlight. He was reclaiming the land by surrendering it to its original state. The corporation wanted a dry, flat canvas for their buildings. Silas was turning it back into a marshy, unpredictable wildland. He knew that the locusts would move away from the moisture and the sulfur, pushed by their own instincts toward the only dry ground left, the corporate staging area and the high-rise test plots where the suits had parked their equipment. He was using the insects as a scalpel. He walked back to his porch, the sound of rushing water now competing with the sound of wings. He had opened the veins of the earth. He looked at the red clay on his boots and felt a kinship with the mud. The modern world thinks it can control nature with a switch or a chemical, but Silas knew that you control nature by becoming part of its plan. He sat on his porch and watched the mist rise from the ravine, a white shroud that began to swallow the valley. The locusts in his immediate vicinity were already becoming sluggish, their wings heavy with the sudden dampness. They were landing, crawling, searching for heat, and the heat was all concentrated in the corporate camp, where the generators were humming and the lights were blazing. Silas smiled, a slow, tired smile. The iron key was back in his pocket, warm from the friction of the turn. He had unleashed a defense that nobody else thought to open, because nobody else knew how to listen to the silence of the red clay. He wasn't just a farmer anymore. He was the gatekeeper of a memory. The reckoning was coming, and it wouldn't be led by men, but by the water and the wind. At dawn, the corporate camp was a scene from a nightmare. The locusts, fleeing the cool, sulfurous mist that Silas had released, had converged on the only dry, warm spot in the valley, the AgriCorp headquarters, millions of them. They weren't just eating the grass now. They were clogged in the air intakes of the expensive SUVs. They were shorting out the generators, and they were piling up against the trailer doors like a living snowdrift. The high-tech chemical sprayers designed for dry application were useless in the thick, heavy mist that Silas had conjured from the earth. The chemicals turned into a milky, ineffective film that slid off the leaves and into the mud. Sterling, the man with the silk suit, was trapped inside his glass-walled office, watching in horror as the swarm blanketed his windows, turning his view of progress into a pulsing wall of brown bodies. Every time they tried to start an engine, the sound of grinding wings echoed through the air. The technology they had boasted about, the drones, the sensors, the automated systems, was failing under the sheer weight of biological reality. Meanwhile, Silas's farm was a quiet island. The mist had settled in a thick protective blanket over his central fields. The locusts avoided the area entirely, held by the mineral scent and the cold. His peripheral crops were lost, yes, but the heart of his farm, the ancient seeds, the heirloom orchards, was untouched. He walked out into the damp air, the mud squelching under his boots, and saw the neighbors standing on the road, staring in disbelief. They saw the corporate giants, the men who were supposed to save them, being literally buried by the plague they had mocked Silas for ignoring. The corporate technology was a joke in the face of a man who knew which gate to open. One of the drones tried to take off to survey the damage, but it only rose 10 feet before a mass of locusts, drawn to its heat, clogged the rotors and sent it spiraling into the muck. Silas watched it fall. It was a perfect metaphor. The arrogant think they can fly above the earth, but the earth has a way of pulling everything back down. By midday, the corporate team was calling for an evacuation. They couldn't stay in the valley. The swarm was too dense. The humidity was ruined for their equipment, and the ground had become a swamp that their polished SUVs couldn't navigate. They were retreating, abandoning their contracts and their plans. The valley was unstable, they said. The soil was contaminated by the sulfur. They didn't understand that the sulfur was the cure. Silas stood by his fence as the last of the black SUVs was towed out by a local tractor. Ironically, a tractor driven by one of the Miller boys who had mocked Silas only days before. As Sterling passed by, his face pale and his suit ruined by mud and insect guts, Silas didn't say a word. He didn't need to. The silence of the farm was the loudest thing in the world. The corporate giants had come to harvest the land's future, but they had been defeated by its past. The wisdom of the old man, the knowledge of the hidden gates and the ancient water, had done more than all the capital in the world could. The swarm was starting to move on, their cycle nearly finished, their energy spent. They left behind a valley that was battered, but a valley that was free. The neighbors looked at Silas with a new kind of fear. The fear you have for something you don't understand, but desperately need. He had saved the soul of the place by letting the body take a beating. He had played a game they didn't even know was being played. The reckoning was complete. The corporate suits were gone, the insects were fading, and all that was left was the smell of damp earth and the sound of a man who knew how to wait. The sun finally broke through the thinning swarm, casting long golden shadows across a valley that looked vastly different than it had a week ago. The corporate trailers were gone, leaving only deep ruts in the mud as a reminder of their brief, arrogant stay. The neighbors eventually came back, their heads no longer bowed, but their eyes full of questions Silas wouldn't bother to answer. Some things aren't meant to be explained. They're meant to be lived. He spent the evening closing the gates, one by one, returning the water to its secret cradles beneath the limestone. The land was saturated. The locusts were a memory of the wind, and the red clay was firming up under the heat. Silas sat on his porch, the iron key heavy and quiet in his pocket. He didn't have the wealth of a corporation, and he didn't have the flashy machines of the modern age. What he had was the stewardship of the soil and the quiet dignity of a man who knows that the earth is the only boss that matters. True power isn't about owning the field. It's about knowing the secrets that lie beneath it. The harvest of silence was the sweetest one yet.